Really, the outcome of these talks is pretty much in line with what Ukrainian officials were saying that they were hoping for before going into them. Progress towards achieving a lasting ceasefire, possible progress towards freeing the prisoners without Ukraine having to give any concessions on the political front in terms of agreeing to hold elections, for example, while Russia still controls that stretch of the border between Russia and the parts of Donbass that Russia de facto controls. The red lines that demonstrators in Kiev were saying over the weekend that Volodymyr Zelensky should not cross apparently were not crossed, at least according to the official declaration. And there are some positive signs, particularly this idea that perhaps the OSCE International Observer Mission could be allowed to work 24/7. That would really make a huge difference, because up till now they've kept office hours whilst observing this conflict, much of the fighting taking place during the night, which people in eastern Ukraine have found quite absurd. If the mission of observation of the ceasefire is really extended, as was proposed, then that might mean that it's going to be easier to make this ceasefire hold. But of course, we have heard promises of a lasting ceasefire in eastern Ukraine before. We have heard very impressive promises of an all-for-all prisoner swap before, without them really materializing. So now Ukrainians are going to be watching as for what happens on the ground. But I think that Zelensky will be able to come home from this to a country that is feeling that basically the boy done good. He didn't cave into pressure from these major world leaders. He stood his ground and said that there were no concessions possible in terms of changing the Ukrainian constitution or giving up having those elections before Ukraine gets control of the border back. And of course, he reiterated very clearly that the whole of Donbass and also Crimea are Ukraine, and Ukraine will always see it that way.
Gulliver, what would you say, though, of the chances of what has actually been decided actually being implemented?
Well, the fear always, of course, is that Vladimir Putin, when he doesn't get what he wants, resorts to violence and to violent pressure. And the reports from Paris were that Vladimir Putin was putting a lot of pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky to try to agree to hold those elections before he got control of the border back, and to have this proposed special status for parts of the Donbass region include a change to the Ukrainian constitution. And Volodymyr Zelensky refused that. The fear would be that Vladimir Putin decides he needs to somehow put more pressure on Ukraine to give in to those demands, and that will happen through an escalation of tensions, an escalation of violence in eastern Ukraine. The hope would be that that won't happen, because there's going to be this, if it does materialize, reinforced observer mission, and perhaps, of course, also because of Vladimir Putin's wider concerns in the international arena, that he is perhaps keen on improving ties with the West and thinks that it's not worth exacerbating tensions in eastern Ukraine for now, because it's possible that Russia sees this result as reasonably satisfactory at all as well. Unfortunately, a lot of people before this summit were saying that really what both sides want is more or less a continuation of the status quo, ideally with a lessening of the level of violence.